I think what a good job is an interesting question, which is they talk about what makes life satisfying. And there's three pieces: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. When parents say good job, they're just like, how do we make money? But that's not the only aspect of a good job. If costs go down significantly on a bunch of stuff, what does that enable us to do to create good jobs for ourselves? And so Girdley puts entrepreneurship as a bullet there. Entrepreneurship has those aspects of autonomy. You run your own business. Mastery. You can constantly be trying to get better at it. It's not something that is static or repetitive. And then purpose. You can design a business or a life that works for you.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave. Did you know that you can get a free business class trip to Japan every year with Haymax AI? Haymax is a rewards app where 500 brands like Apple, Shopee, Amazon, Agoda, and even banks reward you for your loyalty by contributing towards your dream vacation. Through the Haymax app, every transaction you make earns you Max Miles, which you can redeem for free travel at more than 25 airline and hotel partners. Sign up at haymax.ai now to get a 1,000 Max Miles head start. Turn your daily transactions into dream vacations. Your business can also leverage the highly cost-efficient and desirable loyalty currency called Max Miles that has no expiry, no fees, and instantly one-to-one transferable to 24 airlines and hotels to acquire new customers and drive repeat sales with no integration required. Reach out to Joe at haymax.ai and mention Brave to uplevel your rewards game and reduce your cost. Hey, Shiyan.
How's it going, Jeremy?
Good. I'm glad to be back in the real world. I just came back from 2 weeks in the Singapore military.
Do you lose
So
weight when you go to
yeah,
reservists?
I should. It's
Marching
just that.
around in the jungle.
So I
That's not
used to
what you
do.
do.
No, that's all I did. So when I was 18, 21, that's why I definitely did a lot of jungle, a lot of exercise. And now as a middle-aged adult, I spend a lot of time in air-conditioned rooms, obviously working with computers and PowerPoint, Excel. And basically when they posted me back for my recent posting, I basically got posted to a planning division, like at a very high senior level. So I started my Monday in the military in another aircon room with computers and PowerPoint and Excel.
No, how
But
disappointing.
I know, right? And then they fed me the same way they would feed like an 18-year-old. So like lots of rice, lots of chicken and fish and ice cream and snacks, cream rolls and biscuits. I was like, oh, this is amazing. I am like eating like I'm young again, except I'm not. I'm in this husk of a body still doing desk work. Yeah. So I was eating for breakfast like nasi padang, which is like rice and Malay. My friends were like, what are you doing? I was like, yeah, I'm not allowed to eat this at home. It's like too much carbs and coconut milk. It was my little mini vacation. Yeah.
It's funny. Gosh, you're making me hungry. I've been in the US for 3 weeks and I just want to eat some nasi padang.
Yeah, I know. That's all the stuff you can't really find. So yeah, what are you up to in the US right now?
I mean, we had our US Camp Hustles. It's an investor conference that we host annually, and it's the 3rd time we've done it. So it's gotten even bigger in prior years. We had our team offsite, and we just had a bunch of meetings and took the opportunity to kind of just catch up with people, see founders, reconnect with other investors that we work with. So it's been a bit of a longer trip. And whenever I come here, I don't eat any because I'll just be disappointed. So I've had guacamole like 5 times, and I've eaten a lot of kale salad. Fruits and vegetables taste better here, but I'm getting on a plane shortly, and I definitely am going to go home and eat bak chor mee and be very happy about it.
Yeah, those are all the good. So, you and I were catching up, right? And we were comparing the Southeast Asia versus the US tech ecosystem, which is always a common question because I think both you and I have experience in both tech ecosystems. I think that another one that just came out recently was that our dear Terrence Lee, editor-in-chief of Tech in Asia, basically wrote an editor's note. And he basically said that, hey, he's quite bearish about like Southeast Asia as a singular market. And I think he pulls up this chart that we'll put up in the podcast visual, but also put it log. But basically, it compares the median distributions, right? So how much money do VC funds make, right? And then it shows basically that over the past 8 to 10 years, the vintage of 2013 to 2015, the US is about 1x, India is about 1.3x, Europe is about 0.7x, China is at 0.6x, and Southeast Asia is the worst at about 0.4x. So this comes from the Bain collaboration on the economy, Southeast Asia 2023 report. And basically it's kind of saying like, another way of saying it is like VC funds are not performing well historically in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I think there's like a couple things to tease apart there, which is what is the actual company building and development that's going on? And then the second one is what is the performance of the venture funds? Because I think they're related but not the same thing. And so I think one thing to note is between 2024 versus 2004, the amount of venture dollars 10x'd. So there's just like I saw the stat for the US, and I actually think the stat for Southeast Asia is even starker, right? It's an even bigger increase in dollars that are flowing into the ecosystem. And I think that has the impact of like, does that mean that there were 10x more founders, 10x more backable companies? If we just use the US one because 10x is a nice round number. And I think the answer is probably not. And so what happened, right? We all talk about ZERP, but like the impact is companies raised more money at higher valuations than they would have in a more capital constrained environment, which drove down returns. So I think that impact is probably exacerbated in Southeast Asia as well, where I think if you ever review any of the funds raised charts, right, like the vast majority of money went to a small number of companies. And so I think there's just like the math there, the law of like, it's really hard to turn large numbers into much larger numbers versus small numbers into like medium-sized numbers. So I think that's one thing that's happening, just like the venture funding stuff. And I think the separate and the more interesting question is around, okay, do you think software and the internet and technology, can you build big companies, scaled outcomes, and is it easier or harder to do in the US? And I think building companies is never easy. Item one, but there are challenges in both scenarios, which is I think that in Southeast Asia, we like to talk about it as a region, but the reality is that it's not. It's 6 core markets, 10, 11, I guess we can include East Timor overall. They're all quite different currency, different language, different laws. So you don't really get the scaled economies necessarily on a business that you would imagine when you think of scaling, because every time you launch a new country, you actually have to spin up like a fair amount of overhead for that. And then the US, while it is a single country, single currency and language, I think the level of competition is higher. And so that's not exactly an apples to apples comparison either. But it is true, right? It's would you rather have 300 million people with per capita GDP 45K or our so-called 600 million people, but actually the per capita GDP is anything from 1,000 to 60,000 or whatever the number for Singapore is now, except there's only 5 million of them. I think it's a fair comment, but I think they're not exactly apple to apple.
You know, you reminded me that we've discussed this topic in many different formats, and I feel like the media is kind of like catching up to some of the difficulties. And I think part of this, like you said, is really the oversupply of capital versus the opportunity set. And now I think people are starting to try to build up the rest of the ecosystem and catch up. So training founders, getting the right playbooks, explaining it this skill doesn't really work across different countries, at least not as easily as you think it is. And so I think there's a lot of dynamics that I think are starting to become more appreciated. But that reminds me of the sort of recent Bain report that came out. So I'm just going to look at the computer here. 2 of my old Bain colleagues, Suvir Varma as well as Usman Mokhtar. So they're both partners at the Bain Southeast Asia private equity practice. And I think this was interesting was that they identified something that we've kind of talked about, which is there needs to be a stronger local capital markets. So obviously most Southeast Asian tech companies are headed out New York or US stock exchange, but the retail investors, the coverage there is pretty weak. And so local stock exchanges is one of the exit paths for private equity as well as VC. But unfortunately, the velocity of the stock exchanges in the region are relatively low, right? So the New York Stock Exchange as a benchmark is about 103%, whereas the Singapore Stock Exchange is about 32%. And then the Indonesia Stock Exchange is about 19%. And then the Philippines would be at 73%. And then, of course, Shanghai is at 192%. But basically, it's saying that there's a lot of trading activity from retail and institutional investors, and that creates ability for private equity in general, the whole asset class, to be able to exit in the, you're a local company in Indonesia, then maybe the most natural place for you to list would be in the Indonesia Stock Exchange.
Yeah, I mean, I think China's stock exchange is the third largest by market cap. And then they have 3 exchanges, right? The main board, and then they have the 2 smaller ones for smaller companies and startups. And so, not to mention the Hong Kong one as well, which is like a 4th available market for Chinese companies to go public on. I think there's also the role of capital controls, which is that for Chinese retail and Indian retail, they're actually much more limited in their ability to access offshore equities. And so they demand like some place to deploy their savings. And so it actually is going into domestic offerings, which is like a really important part of that capital cycle. And I think this is the other thing that maybe we've talked about before, but it's we lack a lot of the companies in the middle. We have tons of really early stage startups, and then we have a couple of big behemoths. But really, the heart of the innovation ecosystem is like the mid-size. And those mid-size companies and mid-size outcomes aren't going to make it to the NASDAQ. But they're important because either they get bought and really they recycle talent and experience through the ecosystem, and they give enough middle liquidity options. So yeah, I agree. This is like a really good point, but I don't know. I guess I should probably go learn more about this, but I don't know. Are there any efforts to try to build a regional exchange where everyone's all trying to dominate with their own local exchanges?
Yeah, I'm happy to share more about that. I mean, I think, first of all, I agree with you about the capital controls piece and the access. I think the India Stock Exchange has been a destination for a lot of Indian startups. I think it also explains a lot of the excitement because I think people feel like, hey, when you build a startup in India, then you have the opportunity to list on the India Stock Exchange, but also the ability to list on the US Stock Exchange if you need to. But that kind of glide path doesn't really seem to work very well for Southeast Asian startups. So again, it's kind of like go big or really go home in that sense. I think the Singapore Stock Exchange is and was the natural place for a regional stock exchange. I mean, Singapore as a hub, there's a lot of the financial density terms of it. Because when you think about stock exchange, it's not just retail investors, but also institutions who are doing that. You need market analysts to write reports, like initiating coverage or continuing coverage to be like, hey, should you buy or sell? And of course, you need a list, you need a supply of those companies coming on to generate the excitement and so forth. So it's a little bit like call it two-sided marketplace or three-sided marketplace, but I think you need to get that flywheel really going. And I think the Singapore Stock Exchange has really been focus on protecting Singaporean retail investors. So they don't really want loss-making companies to be on the Singapore stock. I think there's a catalyst list. But there's a whole bunch of rules that basically make it pretty difficult for, I'll say, a large size tech company that hasn't losing money to list on the Singapore Stock Exchange. And then basically, I'll probably have to kind of find the exact numbers later. But basically, I think what I'm hearing from a lot of founders is like, the rules for Singapore Stock Exchange is I can list at a lower valuation, but I have to be profitable. But it's so close to the US where I can be still burning net cash and I can list it at a higher revenue. So it feels like I might as well just go one step bound and just go for the US side and just keep going on the growth engine route and then list on the US. And so you end up skipping the Singapore Stock Exchange because it doesn't provide you any of that off ramp. And obviously, I think you can see the dynamics here, which is I can imagine the Singapore government being like, let's protect retail investors. And the other side is very much, but why do we even bother with Singapore Stock Exchange if I have to be this size and net profitable in order to raise any capital? I might as well go for the.
I guess the other one we haven't talked about is ASX, the Australian one. And there's a
Yeah,
couple of players that have gone that route as well.
yeah, Australia Stock Exchange has often been a big story, right? For a lot of the Australian VC funds, I think they feel comfortable with that as a destination. What were the companies again that listed on the ASX?
I think iProperty, Atlassian was there before, right? They moved
Yeah,
to the US
Atlassian.
exchanges.
Yeah, Zero,
Zero. But
XE,
the
yeah,
Kiwi company, they were
XERO,
on the
yeah.
New Zealand one. And
So excited for the Southeast Asia tech ecosystem. We've just been dropping bad news. Everyone's like, I'm listening to this podcast now. And I'm like, okay, I need to stop listening to this podcast and go back to a quiet or another US company podcast.
I think my belief is that there's still lots of things to be built in the Southeast Asia ecosystem. And I actually am quite excited about with the advent of all of the LLMs and AI tools, and given Southeast Asia's role in call centers, BPOs, and other service types of industries, I think there's an opportunity to build really interesting companies leveraging these tools. So a fun stat I heard, and I wonder which analyst had to go dig this up. If you sum the revenue of all publicly traded SaaS companies last year, it is less than the revenue of the big four accounting firms. And I think that's an interesting thing because services have previously been pretty hard to penetrate with software, right? There's like a whole class of work where it's basically like historically it's too nuanced to automate, like every corner case. And so even if you say, okay, what was Salesforce's revenue last year? Salesforce is like the dominant CRM provider. It's like what, 60 billion? But instead think about all the customers of Salesforce, all the salespeople that use Salesforce, and you multiply it by the salary of those salespeople, right? It's orders of magnitude. And so if you can start automating those things away, that's actually a huge opportunity. I think that is increasingly in the realm of possibility. And so I think for Southeast Asia is to think about what are the application level things that you're going to do with these new tools and the types of businesses you can build with a fully integrated human plus AI stack. And it's interesting, I've had a bunch of conversations with founders over the last couple weeks that I've been here where people are like, should I build Copilot for X or should I go out and build a full stack company? Am I better off trying to sell a tool to other old school people, or hey, I should build an AI native company from day one and take that whole profit pool myself? So I don't think that that's like all doom and gloom about Southeast Asia, because one thing we do have is we do have much lower labor costs. And so would you rather have a Southeast Asian plus AI competing at the third of the price of an American plus AI? That's my bull case, Jeremy.
Yeah, I know. It's like my counter argument to that would be like AI is so much cheaper than any cheap labor that is a high fixed cost structure, very zero marginal cost. So US AI full stack will outcompete Southeast Asia labor plus AI. Who knows? I mean, I think the world's so globalized. But it actually reminds me of the debate that we kind of like started pulling on this thread, right? Which is what's a good job? And I think some listeners kind of like messaged us, hey, Shiyan, you and I were discussing like what's a good job that parents should fight for our kids. And then we were like kind of having that little. So I think people just wanted to hear more about that. What's a good job in a Southeast Asia context? I think it's triggered by a similar tweet by Michael Gertley. So his thesis was he thinks that the big trends from his US perspective is globalization of workforce, reindustrialization of USA, shrinking of birth rate, emergence of AI, and increasing US government spending. So he's bearish on software developers, accountants, graphic design, customer service, and lawyers. And then he's bullish on anything tied to government contracts or government jobs, healthcare, high risk engineering like aerospace, entrepreneurship, and anything that touches physical things. And lastly, finance and wealth management. So what do you think?
I mean, I think some of these are universal themes, right? We have the Chinese term iron rice bowl. So I think people have always talked about working on government related things in such a manner. So I'm supportive of that. I think globalization is a trend for everyone, not just Americans. It's just that Americans started with a higher cost base, right? So for them, the competition is coming up from the bottom. And then I think basically if the job requires doing anything repetitive, plus now if the edge on the repetition was your language skills, that's probably all going to go away, right? I would agree with that. I think though we forget about how much of the economy does deal with in-person and physical things. You're a physical therapist. AI is not going to take your job.
The next to you, this humanoid robot that's just like massaging your foot, pressing your acupuncture pressure points.
It's going to be a while. It's going to be a while until those things are automated, right? I think those things are harder. Although some of the robot demos I've seen in the last couple of weeks have been pretty impressive. But I do think there are things like that in-person stuff, which is just going to be harder to automate away. So I think what a good job is an interesting question, right? Which is they talk about what makes like life satisfying. And there's three pieces: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And I think when parents say good job, they're just like, how do we make money? But that's not the only aspect of a good job. I guess if we did think about it, if costs go down significantly on a bunch of stuff, like what does that enable us to do to create good jobs for ourselves? And so Girdley sort of puts entrepreneurship as a bullet there. And I think that's a really interesting one, which is that driving costs down actually enables people to build businesses with way fewer people. Entrepreneurship has those aspects of autonomy, you run your own business, mastery, you can actually constantly be trying to get better at it. It's not something that is static or repetitive. And then purpose, right? You can design a business or a life that works for you. So I think people make these bombastic ones like, oh, we're going to see the first one-person unicorn. But unicorn is a very rare outcome. And I don't think that's actually most people's aspirations. If you actually said to people like, hey, you could run a business that did $1 million of free cash flow a year. It only costs you, I don't know, $100K to start up over a number of years. I think a lot of people would take that. They would consider that a good job. Yeah, I think that's the only sort of additional color that I would add to Girdley's predictions, which is I do think that part of what it enables, it actually enables people to shape their lives a lot differently, because a bunch of stuff that you might have had to hire a ton of people to do in the past, you actually can automate, which allows you to be creative and think about what are the customer needs in the market that I uniquely can go address in my ecosystem.
It's interesting because I thought that I agreed, for example, with healthcare, because first of all, it's regulated on a per country basis. So you can't practice easily by moving from America to Indonesia. And obviously, it's handling people who are in person. So I think doctors do a good job. Actually, I feel like lawyer is still a good job in Southeast Asia. So from my perspective, there's so much of your country's law system that's not just about law, right? In terms of the code or the writing of contract, but also about the relationship transactions that had to be done. And you still have to strike deals. So I still think law, maybe he's bearish on law in America, but I would feel that law in Southeast Asia is probably more straightforward. And I felt like software engineer is still a good job in Southeast Asia as well, because you're upgrading yourself, you're giving yourself productivity, you're working your way up. I still think that being a software engineer in Southeast Asia is still a decent path if your child wants to go there and have affinity for that, because it's a way to increase more labor productivity by using robots. So some of it is maybe like a US context thing, but I would say like software engineer and law is still for Southeast Asia. But yeah, I think accounting is tough. That's a tough job. It's hard to be the
Well, I think
computer
it's what
programmer.
part of law, right? It's the complex stuff on the margin, like the repeatable stuff.
Yeah. Divorce law, I mean, it'd be good. I mean, I think Southeast Asia will see more divorce rates over time rather than less. So you can say it's a growth industry on the law side. It is true. Divorce rates are going up. The world is becoming more westernized or globalized, how you want to call it. What is it? Like 50% of American marriages end in divorce. It's a huge sector.
They say that, but I feel like the countervailing force is that people get married later, which I think should actually improve marriage success rates. You know yourself a little bit better. But yeah, I don't know. I don't have a informed opinion on that topic.
Good jobs for your kids. I mean, I think Peter Thiel was basically writing a post, right? He's saying that, hey, the American education system in general is way too focused on math as a skill set. In order for you to become a doctor, to qualify, you need to do well in math compared to other activities like humanities are underweighted skill set. And so his argument as well is that with more robots coming into the workforce, they are going to displace or improve or augment mathematical ability a lot better, and all your verbal skills are going to be much more valuable in this new environment.
Is that true? I mean, I guess to the extent that people use math as a weeder on things, you're like, yeah, why is that a prereq? But I mean, doctors still have to do math, right? Like, you have to think about dosing, you have to think about like rate of blood flow. I mean, there's some quantitative ability in math. It's not like totally devoid of things. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's verbal or it's more just like being a human. I don't know if this is an American thing, but yeah, what motivates the other person? How do you get to yes? What are people's incentives? All those sorts of things. I think those things are not really taught in school. And I think understanding how to figure those things out are probably harder for AI to do. Although people have used AI very successfully in writing complaint letters and all these sorts of things that you're like, hey, this is this person's parameters. These are your parameters. Help me write a letter that gets me out of this thing. So who knows? Maybe that will get there too. But maybe the real-time in-person types of negotiation that have to happen, maybe that's one of the last things to get automated.
I'm reading this sci-fi novel series called The Culture by Ian Banks. And basically it is like AI is so good that everybody lives in a post-scarcity kind of like anarchist kind of society because all the robots are just better at humans in every dimension. Just don't bother learning math. I mean, you can learn math if you want to, but just the computers will do it faster, better, and they already have done it for you. Verbally, they're better at negotiating and doing everything. So humans are just kind of like this accessory to a drone AI society.
That's depressing. I mean, that's like when they're not using all their spare time to make great art or pursue more scientific discoveries.
Weren't you showing me that thing about the music that they're making for you with Suno, right? SUNO, and we can generate a song?
Well, yeah, but I mean, this is all about the average, right? So yeah, it allows the person with no songwriting ability to now create a song, but it's not going to create the next Taylor Swift. Although I do think people have been launching AI songs onto Spotify.
Oh, yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know. We should do a predictions episode, Jeremy, and then our kids will listen to it in 30 years and laugh at us and be like, oh my God, they were so wrong. They had no idea what the future was going to look like.
Just blame our parents. Like, they trained me to be a software engineer, but it turns out I'm useless.
That wasn't me. That wasn't me. That was Jeremy. That's all
That was
Jeremy's
Jeremy.
fault.
That's my kid's fault. They're blaming me. I was like, oh, thank goodness I learned to join the government. On that note, actually, what I'll do is I want to share my screen, but you told me about that song generation thing. I'll show what we did. So I did. Can you see my screen here? So
coming up.
It's coming up.
Yep.
So you asked me, hey, Jeremy Suno. So just now I typed in a pop song about Brave Southeast Asia Tech Podcast and how startup founders are amazing, showing lyrics. Just hit the create button and here's a song, right? Brave Voices and Airwaves. Okay. I don't know if you can hear the sound. I'm gonna press play. Let me see again. Can you hear it?
I can.
Okay. So you heard the song. I guess we have to make a Brave
You have
Southeast
to
Asia podcast.
put that in the show notes.
It's like the new theme song every morning. We just create a new song, and then they made another. What is this, a second version? Oh, they give you two different songs.
It's the same words but different music.
Let me press this now. In the hustle, they believe. Oh, this is really good. This is a good song. Okay. That was. I mean, the
good,
first one
right?
already blew.
Don't you
The
want
first
to go
one-
play with this?
I know. I mean, the first one already blew my mind. The fact that you mentioned the company, I plugged it in, but then this second one was pretty good. I gotta say, they had a beat. then a drop. I don't even know what to say. So,
I mean, I think it's awesome. Technology is awesome. That's what you should say.
I mean, you were telling me earlier that this is your new party trick, right? You show it off to your guests to make songs about. It is a very good. So, should your kids be a musician?
Yeah.
Orchestra is a bad idea.
I
Is a
mean,
bad idea.
I think this isn't going to replace live music, right? If you're someone who's performing in front of audiences, like you're not going to go to a wedding and be like, hey, look, I made you an AI song or whatever. Like you still have musicians. So I think there's still, it's not that you can't have a musical career. You just have to think about which segment you belong and how you think you're going to excel in that thing. But it's the median, right? I think the idea is like AI is not going to outcompete you in that one thing that you are like truly excellent in, but you need to think about that, which is what is your competitive set? Because all the sort of average outcomes, I think those will get competed away.
That's a tough one. I mean, everybody thinks they're above average, right? But a lot of people are average. So I think I'm above average on singing, but my friends tell me I'm terrible, below average in karaoke.
Yeah, but you're not trying to make a living singing.
True. I guess it's one way to end. Shall we resume the rest of the song to close out this episode?
Sure.
All right. All right. AI is taking your jobs. AI is taking your job. AI is taking your job.
It's not what it says.
Okay, all right. See, that's my value add. I added like a counterpoint verse, you didn't like my addition?
All right, Jeremy. Remember how we said that you're not an above average singer? I think you've just given us data to corroborate that.
Yeah. I was like the guy dancing in the background. I'm like the background dancer, like dancing horribly and adding counterpoints. There you go. Peace out, Shiyan.
Comedic relief, if you will.
Okay, so that's my value add.
Bye.
All right, yeah. Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.